Okay, this is part 2 of the storytelling lecture that we began last week in class. And you'll remember that we talked specifically about the grammar of cinema and why grammar is so important to filmmakers, and why when we are watching a film that doesn't follow some of the rules that we've all decided a film should, we are less moved by it, less interested, we click away. All these responses that you have to the movies that you're watching very often can be attributed to the structure of the film or the grammar that the filmmaker follows. So when you're watching a very good movie, it's probably arguable that that movie is really well structured. That you can say it's going to be well acted, well directed, but if you dive into the screenwriting of really good movies, you can see some things that are consistent from 2,500 years ago, theater, 3 people on a stage with a Greek chorus, to 2020. When a drama works, it tends to have a structure that we recognize as being dramatic. And so that's what this lecture is about. It's again, thinking about how we're going to build these films to fit that dramatic structure that we're used to seeing. And so what I would ask you to do is, while I'm talking today, please pull out wherever you're going to take notes. I'm going to ask you during this lecture to come up with some ideas, write some dialogue, write an ending, and write that surprise ending. And I know we did some of this last week. We're going to work on it again this week, so that when you do drop into your groups, you have something to offer where everybody in the group can say, well, here's what I'm thinking about. And hopefully through collaboration and improvisation, you guys can begin to put together a film idea. So we know that storytelling is based on oral traditions, oral histories that were passed down from our ancestors before even writing and before we got up on stage and produced plays and before we made movies. There was this kind of storytelling impulse that is fundamentally human, this need to tell our stories, to mark our time. One of the things that we talked about last week is this idea of amplification, where we take a small incident, one that may be from our lives, and we amplify it through the medium of storytelling to make it something that is memorable. So say you had a bad date, right? You had a bad Match.com date, and it was just kind of bad, right? It wasn't terrible, it wasn't great, one time only. Now, if you're going to put that into a film, you probably amplify the bad aspects of that. And how do you amplify it? That's what you come up with as an author. How do you take that bad date that you lived through and make it so horrific that it engages an audience, either through humor or through horror? And these are some of the questions that we should be asking now. And so what I would ask you to do in your notes is come up with a list of 2 or 3 things, and I'll give you 30 seconds to do this. 2 or 3 things that have happened in your life that you think would be worth writing about. Small things, doesn't matter, no pressure. You're not going to turn this into me. This is just a brainstorming session. So let's take 30 seconds, write down 2 stories, shorthand, things that happened to you. Okay, if you guys are watching this lecture in the recorded style, you can always hit pause and then come back into it. But I'm gonna pick this up. So once we've done this, once we have the kernel of the idea that we want to convey in a dramatic form, we have to put it inside of a narrative structure. And you'll notice I use narrative all the time. I use the term narrative to define the type of films that we study. So films that employ actors engaged in something called mimesis, which is an old Greek word. but essentially it means pretend. They're pretending to be other people in a dramatic format. So actors in mimesis, working with a screenplay in a narrative structure is what we're after. And the structure is what I want to talk about now. So these three sources here that I'm finally to the screen share. These three sources here that I have on this PowerPoint slide are they just happen to be my three favorite. I think that if you guys spend enough time studying dramatic structure, you'll find, first of all, that there are probably 100 sources you could pull this thinking from. And you may find that there are three others out of that 100 sources that you like better, but these just happen to be the ones that I found to be the most resonant. And I'm going to very briefly walk you through these three, with the caveat that if you're interested, take the screenwriting class and we'll talk about these for 15 weeks. But Aristotle was one of the very first Western dramatic theorists. So he was writing about 2,500 years ago. He was a scientist. He's not a playwright. He's not a poet. Aristotle was a scientist, and his vocation and avocation was describing the way that things worked in the world. So he described biology, he described public speaking, he described politics, and he also described performance and theory, theater theory. And he has a whole list of these things, which I'm not going to go over in a great deal now because I do it later. But I will say, for our purposes now, some of the things that Aristotle thought were really important were plot. He said plot was by far the most important thing. So first off, what is the story that you're telling? What happens in this plot? And again, I would just ask you, rather than writing down Aristotle in notes, write down some ideas for plot. So the bad date, right? Is it a Friday night? Is it a Wednesday night? Is it a work night before a presentation? Let's say it's Tuesday and our main character's got a presentation to give at work the next day that's either going to get her fired or not fired. The job has been going roughly, but she matched with somebody and she desperately wants to go on this date. So she decides to take a break and to try to get back to her presentation. And that's plot, right? It's the things that happen in this film. It's not the internal monologue. It's not the dialogue that's said between the characters. It's not the music or the look of the film. It's the plot. So Aristotle said that was most important. And Aristotle also said, and I'll move on in a second, he also said that the plot should end with some sort of massive reversal, where everything that we think is happening turns in a surprise ending. And so when I'm talking to students about short films, I say that really that's all you need. You don't need all of the rest of Aristotle. We need some sort of plot with the statement of dramatic need. So this character I was talking about, you know, she says something to the effect of, if I don't get out of this work, I'm never going to get this promotion or whatever. I need this. And then some kind of surprise ending. So I would ask you, and I'll give you 30 seconds again here as well. What is the dramatic need of your character? What does this character need? And go ahead and write it out in your notes. And then what could the surprise ending be? What could the surprise ending be? Okay, so two quick notes about Sid Field and Save the Cat. Sid Field was a theorist writing about Hollywood cinema from the 1950s until the 1990s. And many Hollywood movies used his thinking. And what Sid Field said that was most useful was that the audience likes to see when there is something in the plot that changes the direction of the story. So the surprise ending at the end that Aristotle calls for In Sid Field, those surprises happen throughout the structure. And Sid Field says that there should be eight surprises in a movie, and two major surprises, one at page 30, one at page 60. And those two major surprises drive the story forward, and they are things imposed by the world on the main character. So say this character is at the restaurant on the date, and the boss shows up to get carry out to take back to the office, right? I mean, I don't know that I would do that, but that's an example of the kind of thing where the plot imposes something different on the character. So the boss shows up. She drops her phone down a sewer grate, and it's got her presentation for the next day on it. I don't know. And then finally, the last thing, Blake Snyder says in Save the Cat, that you should give the audience something that indicates to them who the lead character is, who's the person we should cheer for. And he writes specifically that you show that character saving a cat from a tree. So we're watching a movie, we don't know who the good guys are, who the bad guys are, who the hero is, who's the mean girl, but the movie will take us to a tree and show this character pulling the cat out of the tree and putting it on the ground, and we say, oh, that's the person I'm going to cheer for. So he calls that Save the Cat, but you see it in films all the time in totally different ways. Somebody's nice to a kid, somebody helps an old lady across the street, somebody gives money to charity. It's a small thing, but it's really useful structurally to help the audience to understand, where this movie is going. Okay, so I'm going to take a break here for a second. And what I'd like you to do is I would like you to write. Let's take a 2-minute writing session. And please come up with ideas, brainstorming ideas based on Aristotle, Sid Field, Save the Cat. In other words, dramatic need and reversal at the end, plot that changes the character's directionality, and some way of indicating who the important character is for us to cheer for. And I'll pause the recording. We'll take 2 minutes to do this, and I'll be back in 2 minutes. Okay, guys, so I'm back in the recording, and I wanted to just list Aristotle really quickly. Again, we talk about this more completely in the spring semester, but Aristotle had 6 elements that he described as in every single dramatic text. And he ranked the 6 elements from the most important with plot to the least important, but it's useful to remember that he said all of them should be there. And I like thinking of the original Star Wars Episode 4. Star Wars Episode 4, the original, has all of these elements in such a fascinating way. So Aristotle said, you count down from the top to the end, all of these have to be here, but number 1 is more important than number 2, which is more important than number 3. So plot, Star Wars, will the Rebel Alliance defeat the Empire? The characters, Darth Vader, Luke Skywalker. The thought, shouldn't we be free, right? There's all this stuff about democracy in there, and all of the Star Wars series deals with that thesis pretty substantially. So if you're watching the Clone Wars animated series, it deals with these same ideas all the way through. That's what Star Wars is always about. Dialogue, music, and spectacle are the last 3 on this. And we can think in the films that we really like how important these things are. And I use Star Wars as the example here because of the way that music and spectacle are embedded into that movie in such a fascinating way. So it's a film, that's a film as an example that has all 6 elements with the surprise ending that Aristotle talks about. Now, I don't know if everybody's seen Star Wars, so I'm not going to tell you what the surprise is, but those of you that have seen it, you know what I'm talking about. You know how that film structures itself to the end, the very end, and how that reversal happens. And then the last thing, and I mentioned this last week as well, I'll remind you, recognition, where we as an audience want to see the character seeing their success or failure. So if a character fails miserably, we need to see that character living through that. And if a character succeeds, we need to see that. And think about the way that Star Wars structures that coda, that not the climax, but the thing that happens afterward, and the way that is structured. Purely Aristotelian, and amazing how someone writing, 2,500 years ago can be seen to be so relevant to our current culture. So this Sid Field paradigm, we will cover it much more exhaustively in the screenwriting class next semester. But just know that this is really an important diagram for Hollywood cinema. And then this is the Save the Cat beat sheet, which you'll use and see much more in screenwriting. In fact, it's the final exam is filling out this beat sheet in that class. So I'm going to stop the recorded lecture now.